Welcome to Bella&Goch. Today, we are exploring the industrial nightmare that is Hurston Dynamics, a corporation so woven into the fabric of the Stanton system that its name has become synonymous with both human ambition and human suffering. To understand why this single entity controls an entire planet, we need to look beyond the smog-choked skies of Lorville and examine the architecture of power itself. How does a mining conglomerate evolve from a fledgling startup to a planetary government? What happens when profit margins become more important than breathable air? And why, after nearly 3 centuries of operation, does Hurston remain the blueprint for corporate governance in human space? These are the questions that define not just one company, but an entire era of expansion. To trace the roots of this industrial Leviathan, we must travel back to the late 22nd century, when Hurston Dynamics was merely one of dozens of mining outfits scrambling for resources in the early expansion wave. The company's founder, Wallace Hurston, understood something his competitors did not. That true power came not from extracting minerals, but from owning the means of survival itself. While others sold ore, Hurston sold air, water, and shelter, vertically integrating every aspect of colonial life until departure became economically impossible. By the time the UEE formalized the Stanton system in 2865, Hurston had already built the infrastructure of dependency so thoroughly that the government simply acknowledged reality and granted them planetary governance. This was not corruption in the traditional sense. It was efficiency made manifest. But here is where the narrative takes its inevitable turn toward the shadows that stain Lorville's perpetual twilight. When a corporation controls the atmosphere processors, the housing blocks, and the only legal exit from the planet, the distinction between employer and sovereign dissolves entirely. Workers do not sign contracts. They accept terms of existence, trading decades of labor for the privilege of breathing filtered air in prefabricated coffins. The Advocacy calls it legal governance, the workers call it indentured servitude, and Hurston calls it quarterly growth. And this is the truly unsettling truth. The system functions. Ships leave the orbital platforms laden with refined materials. The UEE collects its taxes, and the machinery of empire grinds on. We must ask ourselves whether this is the inevitable endpoint of unrestricted corporate expansion, or merely the beginning. When a corporation controls the atmosphere processors, the housing blocks, and the very air you breathe, the line between employer and sovereign vanishes entirely. This wasn't some accidental byproduct of expansion or a bureaucratic oversight to be corrected later. It was the foundational blueprint of the Hurston model from day one. Workers didn't sign employment contracts so much as surrender their citizenship wholesale, trading political rights for the privilege of survival in a transaction that generations later still defines the socioeconomic fabric of Stanton. The company archives call this efficient, vertical integration, but the labor historians at Terra's universities use markedly different terminology: corporate feudalism with better public relations. And here's the detail that never makes it into the recruiting holograms. Hurston didn't just build a city to house workers. They engineered a closed ecosystem where dependency wasn't a side effect of the business. It was the entire business model itself. Now we arrive at the moments that the Hurston family prefers to file under industrial disputes, and everyone else calls something else entirely. Take the atmosphere processor riots of 2912, when workers in District 18 discovered the company had been siphoning oxygen credits to fund executive bonuses, literally charging people to breathe the air they were choking on. The Advocacy response wasn't negotiation. It was the L-19-9 security meches, deployed not to restore order, but to clear the square. 300 dead in 17 minutes, and the official report calls it equipment malfunction. But here's the pattern that repeats. Every time labor organizers gain traction, Hurston doesn't just fire them, they blacklist entire family lines from the atmospheric registry. How do you organize when your children can't legally inhale? So what does this legacy look like in the year 2954, when the neon of Lorville still flickers against that perpetual chemical haze? It looks like the Reclamation Yards, where retired workers sort scrap metal until their lungs give out because pensions were restructured decades ago. It looks like the subtle terror of seeing a Hurston security uniform in the elevators of the worker hab blocks, where due process is whatever the shift supervisor says it is. But perhaps most insidiously, it looks like acceptance. The gradual, generational resignation that this is simply how things are, how they must be, because the alternatives are worse. And this is the true triumph of the Hurston model. Not that it crushed resistance, but that it convinced the survivors they were lucky to be crushed so gently. The system doesn't need walls when it owns the horizon. Scrap until their bodies give out, one coughing breath at a time. And if anyone is wondering how a company gets away with treating human beings like disposable machine parts, the answer is deceptively simple. They've been doing it for centuries, and they've gotten terrifyingly good at the paperwork, the legal jargon, and the quarterly earnings reports that somehow never mention the mortality rates. But to truly understand the mechanics of this exploitation, we need to rewind the tape back to 2865, when Hurston Dynamics first secured the charter for Stanton I. Back then, it wasn't about reclamation yards or the perpetual chemical haze that now blankets Lorville. It was about claim staking and resource extraction on a scale that made the gold rushes of old Earth look like a child's sandbox game. The board members called it efficient colonization, but the workers who first touched down on that toxic soil had another name for it: a death sentence with better marketing and worse retirement benefits. The early days of Hurston weren't just about extracting minerals from a dead world. They were about establishing a template for corporate sovereignty that would redefine the very nature of human expansion in the 29th century. When the first terraformers touched down in those sealed exosuits, they weren't greeted by union representatives or government safety inspectors. They were greeted by daily quotas, by company script that couldn't be spent elsewhere, and by the implicit understanding that every breath of filtered air came with compound interest attached. The real genius of Hurston's founders wasn't in discovering new alloys or refining techniques. It was in realizing that on the lawless frontier, human labor is cheaper than automation and infinitely more replaceable. By 2890, they had perfected the closed ecosystem. Workers born in company housing, educated in company schools, indebted before they could walk, and efficiently cremated in company furnaces when their productivity finally flatlined. It was vertical integration taken to its logical, horrifying conclusion, and it became the gold standard for Stanton's other megacorps. So why does any of this matter to the independent pilot flying through Stanton today? Because Hurston didn't just write the playbook for corporate exploitation. They proved that any corporation could get away with it indefinitely as long as the quantum drives keep firing and the antimatter keeps flowing. The dark side of their legacy isn't just in the smog or the early graves. It's in the acceptance, the normalization of the idea that some people are assets and others are simply maintenance costs to be written off. Those towering worker dormitories silhouetted against the orange sky at Tisa Spaceport stand as monuments to the philosophy that progress requires sacrifice, provided that someone else is doing the sacrificing. And that philosophy didn't stay on Hurston. It followed the trade routes to Pyro, to Nyx, to every corner of the empire, where the law is thin and the profit margins are fat. Become a government unto itself, complete with its own laws, its own security forces, and its own definition of human value. And to understand how we got here, we need to go back to the early 22nd century, when Hurston wasn't yet a household name synonymous with industrial pollution and systematic worker exploitation, but rather a struggling mining consortium on Earth desperate to secure its own future among the stars. They weren't always the giants of Stanton. They started as prospectors with a vision of vertical integration that seemed almost quaint in its ambition. But here's the thing about corporate evolution in the era of space expansion. The companies that survived weren't necessarily the most ethical or the most innovative. They were simply the ones willing to make the deals that others wouldn't touch. By the time the Stanton system opened for privatization in 2865, Hurston had already spent decades positioning themselves as the only logical choice for the massive industrial sector. They'd spent the preceding century acquiring not just extensive mining rights, but politicians, lobbyists, and crucially, the kind of debt leverage that makes central governments genuinely nervous about saying no. So when the UEE announced the so-called grand experiment of corporate governance, Hurston didn't just bid for a planet. They bid for total sovereignty with a comprehensive business plan disguised as a planetary charter. And this is where the story takes its sharp turn into the dark shadows we're familiar with today. Because winning that contract wasn't the end of their ultimate ambition. It was merely the foundation upon which they would eventually build something far more troubling than a simple manufacturing hub. What emerged over the next 70 years was a template for industrial dystopia that would make the old factory towns of Earth look like paradise resorts. We're talking about atmospheric processors that turn the sky orange with particulates, worker housing measured in square meters rather than rooms, and a security apparatus so integrated into daily life that requesting medical attention requires a background credit check. But here's the element that truly defines the Hurston legacy. They didn't just accept the cost of human suffering as an unfortunate externality. They monetized it. Every death in the refinery sector became a data point for efficiency analysis. Every birth required a 17-year employment pre-commitment, and the concept of retirement simply ceased to exist as a viable outcome. And that, more than the smog or the corporate police, is what makes Hurston the gold standard for what corporate governance really means. At atmospheric processors that ran day and night, stripping oxygen and nitrogen from Hurston's skies to feed the refineries below. The air turned yellow, then brown, then a color that didn't have a name in any human language. Workers lived in stacked hab containers just miles from the smelters, breathing through respirators that the company deducted from their wages. And here's the thing that made Hurston different from other corporate ventures. They didn't just tolerate the suffering, they optimized it. Every credit spent on safety was a credit lost to shareholders. Every minute a worker spent recovering was a minute not spent producing. So they kept the shifts long, the air thin, and the expectations impossible. This wasn't negligence. This was design, and it was brutally profitable. By 2800, Hurston Dynamics had stopped pretending to be anything other than a sovereign power with a corporate logo. They owned the legislature, the courts, and the atmospheric processing rights to the entire northern hemisphere. When the UEE tried to impose labor regulations, Hurston simply threatened to slow production of the munitions that kept the Navy's destroyers armed. The empire backed down, because that's the dirty secret of Stanton. The corporations are too big to fail and too essential to control. So Hurston kept expanding, buying up asteroid mining rights, orbital platforms, and eventually the orbital elevators themselves. They didn't just own the means of production. They owned the gravity well, the sky, and the future of everyone trapped beneath it. Today, in 2954, Hurston stands as a monument to what happens when profit margins become the only metric of civilization. The planet is still choking, the workers are still dying, and the executives still wear suits that cost more than a hab worker makes in a decade. But here is what should terrify anyone watching the corporate systems. Every other corporation in Stanton watched Hurston's model and took notes. ArcCorp saw those profit margins. Crusader saw those labor efficiencies. Microtech saw how to turn human beings into renewable resources. Hurston didn't just ruin a world, they wrote the playbook. And as observers look out at the corporate systems beyond Stanton, one has to ask, how many more worlds are following that same script right now? Still conduct board meetings in orbital stations where the air is scrubbed and the windows tint out the rust-colored sky below. But to understand how we arrived at this particular dystopia, we need to rewind nearly 2 centuries to the early days of the Stanton system's colonization. Back then, Hurston Dynamics wasn't the behemoth it is today. It was a modest mining consortium with a single claim and a dangerous gamble on heavy industry. The original charter was simple: extract resources, build infrastructure, and turn a profit for Earth-based investors who had never set foot on the planet. And here's the critical pivot that historians always point to. When the UEE decided to privatize planetary governance rather than administer colonies directly, Hurston didn't just bid for the contract. They saw an opportunity to purchase sovereignty itself. The rise wasn't accidental. It was engineered through a series of aggressive acquisitions that would make modern financial analysts wince with both admiration and horror. Throughout the 28th century, Hurston systematically bought out smaller extraction firms, not for their outdated equipment, but for their ironclad labor contracts and the mineral rights buried deep in bureaucratic fine print. They pioneered what corporate historians now call the asset transfer model, where entire settlements of living, breathing humans were essentially purchased as disposable balance sheet entries rather than sovereign communities. And this is where things get truly disturbing. Instead of investing in expensive automation that might have spared human lives, Hurston executives made a cold calculation that biological workers were cheaper to replace than repairing sophisticated mining droids. By 2700, they controlled not just the planet that bore their name, but the shipping lanes, the atmospheric processors, and the very air filters that kept their workforce barely alive long enough to extract the next shipment of refined materials. But here's the thing nobody talks about when they admire the towering arcologies or the quarterly profit reports. The dark side wasn't a corruption of the corporate vision. It was the vision itself, executed perfectly. The environmental devastation wasn't an unintended externality. It was a cost-cutting measure that worked exactly as designed, allowing them to vent toxic byproducts directly into the atmosphere rather than building expensive filtration systems. Worker mortality rates became just another line item in actuarial tables, with compensation paid to families calculated at a fraction of the cost of safety equipment. So why did the UEE allow this to continue? The answer is depressingly simple. Hurston supplied the alloys that built the Navy's carriers, the fuel that powered the quantum drives, and the political donations that kept oversight committees conveniently understaffed. In the corporate history books, this isn't a tragedy, it's a success story. Executed with mechanical precision from the very first blueprint. When Wallace Hurston III commissioned the original atmospheric processors in 2435, he wasn't trying to fix pollution, he was optimizing it. The calculus was brutal but elegant. Labor is cheaper than machinery, and lungs are more replaceable than filters. So they built the foundries to vent directly into the wind patterns, knowing full well the particulate matter would settle over worker habdomes like a slow death shroud. And when the first generation of colonists started coughing up black resin, the company didn't send doctors. They sent recruiters for the replacement shifts with contracts already prepared. This wasn't negligence. This was design. The question we should be asking isn't how did Hurston become so ruthless, but rather, when did we stop calling this what it actually is? Industrial-scale human farming, measured in quarterly output and written off as acceptable loss on a spreadsheet. By the time the second generation came of age in the mid-2500, this philosophy had ossified into something far more terrifying than cruelty. It had become tradition. The company's stores, the debt indenture contracts, the atmospheric toxicity bonuses. Each innovation in worker exploitation was packaged as economic necessity. And the UEE looked the other way because Stanton's refineries were feeding the Messer war machine. But here's where the psychology gets interesting. Hurston didn't just break labor laws, he rewrote the concept of the employee entirely. Workers became biological assets, their lifespans calculated as depreciation schedules. And the most disturbing part, it worked. Productivity soared, competitor corporations folded or were acquired, and the Hurston model became the standard. When you visit Lorville today and see those hab towers blinking in the smog, you're not looking at a tragedy. You're looking at proof of concept. So here we are in 2954, standing in the shadow of a legacy that never actually ended. The Messers are gone. The Advocacy supposedly enforces labor standards now, and yet the particulate filters still fail on schedule every quarter. Why? Because Hurston Dynamics figured out something that outlasts regimes and regulatory bodies, the banality of corporate evil. It's not mustache-twirling villains ordering executions. It's a logistics AI calculating that replacing a filter costs more than replacing the workers who will breathe the unfiltered air. And that's the insidious genius of it. The system doesn't hate its workers. It's simply indifferent to them in a way that pure malice could never achieve. When we talk about corporate history, we like to imagine redemption arcs and reformations. But Hurston teaches us something darker. That efficiency, unchecked, is just violence with better accounting. Clog the lungs of every worker on the factory floors, and the shift whistles still blow at 18-hour intervals like some dystopian metronome that never winds down. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to 2865, when Wallace Hurston signed the original colonial charter that nobody, not the E, not the workers, certainly not the board, actually bothered to read in full. It was supposed to be a simple mining operation, a straightforward extraction of titanium and rare earth elements from a planet nobody else wanted. But Wallace saw something else entirely in those toxic clouds and heavy gravity planes. He saw a business model where the planet itself was the product, and the people who lived on it were just another resource to be extracted, refined, and depleted according to quarterly earnings reports. By 2890, Hurston Dynamics had transformed from a minor extraction firm into the primary landlord of an entire world, and they weren't interested in stopping there. They bought the debt of failing agricultural colonies in neighboring systems, converted them into processing centers, and pioneered the company's store model on an interplanetary scale. Workers didn't just owe their souls to the corporation. They owed their air, their water, their children's education, and eventually their grandchildren's indenture contracts. The UEE looked the other way because Hurston was meeting production quotas that kept the military-industrial complex humming during the Zeon Cold War. But here's the thing nobody talks about. The real profit wasn't in the ore they pulled from the ground. It was in the debt they manufactured from thin air, trapping generations in a gravity well of compound interest that was harder to escape than the planet's own crushing atmosphere. And this is where things get truly dark, because the system Wallace built didn't just survive the fall of the Messers, it learned from them. When the Advocacy finally raided the executive towers in 2935, they found compliance manuals that read like torture textbooks, and efficiency algorithms that calculated the exact cost of replacing a worker versus treating their chemical pneumonia. The corporation paid the fines, issued the apologies, and kept the filters broken because the math still worked. So why do people still sign those contracts? Why do transport ships still arrive daily full of desperate souls willing to breathe that air for a chance at something they call stability? The answer is simple and brutal. Hurston Dynamics didn't just build a business. They built a trap so elegant, so complete, that even when the door stands open, most workers can't convince themselves that the air outside is actually free. When the Advocacy finally kicked in the doors of the executive towers in 2937, they expected to find smoking guns, deleted manifests, maybe a few shredded contracts proving collusion with the old Messer regime. What they discovered instead was far more disturbing. A system so entrenched, so legally bulletproof, that the raid itself became little more than a public relations exercise in futility. Sure, they seized servers and detained mid-level administrators for show, but the real architecture of control remained completely untouched, because Wallace Hurston III had built his empire not on a legal conspiracy, but on the ruthless exploitation of legal gray zones that no prosecutor could definitively criminalize. Every worker contract, every safety waiver, every cubic meter of toxic runoff dumped into Hurston's atmosphere had been vetted by armies of corporate lawyers who made sure the cruelty stayed technically within the bounds of Stanton's system law. And that is perhaps the most terrifying revelation of all. But here's the thing nobody talks about when we discuss the rise of Hurston Dynamics. The company didn't just inherit the Messer era's authoritarian playbook. They refined it, commercialized it, and turned human suffering into a line item on a quarterly earnings report. Where the Messers ruled through fear of military reprisal, Hurston ruled through the tyranny of debt contracts, company scrip, and atmospheric contamination that kept workers too sick to organize, but just healthy enough to clock in for another 16-hour shift. The weapons changed from plasma rifles to predatory loans, but the bodies kept piling up in the same mass graves outside Lorville. And the truly insidious part, the workers themselves became complicit in their own oppression, because in a system that owns their housing, their air, and their medical debt, rebellion isn't just dangerous, it's economically impossible. So what does this history lesson mean for the spacers flying through Stanton today, 3 decades later and supposedly free? The evidence is written across the smog-choked horizons of Hurston, visible in the company towns where children are born into debt they'll never repay, and apparent in the advocacy patrols that somehow never quite make it to the industrial sectors where the real crimes happen. This isn't a legacy that ended with a single raid or a change in corporate leadership. It's a machine that keeps grinding, having learned that true power doesn't come from the barrel of a gun, but from the fine print. Hurston Dynamics didn't just survive the fall of the Messers, they proved that one doesn't need to rule an empire to own the people inside it. One just needs to make leaving more expensive than staying. Across the sulphurous yellow skies and the corroded domes of Lorville, to understand how a single corporate entity came to own not just an industry, but an entire world, we need to rewind to 2438, when Solomon Hurston filed the incorporation papers that would eventually outlast most Earth nations. Back then, it was just another mining consortium promising efficiency and resource extraction on the frontier. But the charter contained a critical loophole that planetary governments had been warned about: perpetual mineral rights in exchange for infrastructure development. It seemed like a fair trade to cash-strapped early colonists, a way to bootstrap a settlement without taxpayer credits. But that contract became a noose, and every subsequent generation found the terms renegotiated only in one direction. By the 26th century, Hurston Dynamics had stopped asking for permission and started simply administrating. The transition from contractor to sovereign happened gradually, then all at once, as Earth-based oversight weakened and the Messer era centralized power in corporate hands that could deliver results. Solomon's descendants didn't just extract minerals anymore. They owned the atmospheric processors, the housing blocks, the water reclamation, and eventually the private security forces that enforced their contracts. When the UEE finally recognized planetary charters in 2631, Hurston didn't resist integration into the empire. They purchased it, ensuring that imperial law and corporate policy became indistinguishable. The family estate became a planetary government, and every worker became a tenant shareholder with no shares, bound by employment contracts that covered everything from oxygen rations to reproduction rights. And here is the part that the recruitment holos never show. The atmospheric toxicity isn't an industrial byproduct, it's a cost-saving measure. Why invest in scrubbers when the workforce is replaceable and their lungs are considered disposable assets? The yellow haze that blankets Lorville serves as both a chemical dumping ground and a psychological barrier, reminding every resident that they live at the pleasure of the board. 3 centuries of accumulated heavy metals have made Hurston's surface a carcinogenic hellscape, yet the medical debt for treating respiratory illness keeps workers indentured longer than any legal contract could manage. So when we ask who truly owns a world, we should look not at the charter documents, but at who controls the horizon itself, who decides what the sky looks like, and who profits when the air itself becomes a commodity to be rationed. This philosophy didn't emerge overnight. It was baked into the corporate charter from the moment Hurston Dynamics secured the mining rights to Stanton back in 2865. The original board members looked at the planet's rich mineral deposits and saw staggering opportunity, but they also saw the astronomical cost of proper terraforming and environmental compliance. So they made a cold calculation that would define the company for centuries to come. Instead of cleaning the atmosphere, they would simply filter the recruitment pools more aggressively. The first generation of workers signed contracts they barely understood, lured by promises of hazard pay that would never actually cover the medical debt accumulating in their lungs. And when the mortality rates inevitably started climbing within the first decade, Hurston's executives didn't panic or reform. They simply optimized, refining the replacement cycle into a brutal science of human depreciation and asset turnover. By the turn of the 29th century, Hurston had perfected the extraction model to an art form. They weren't just mining precious metals anymore. They were manufacturing weapons through Apocalypse Arms, producing cheap consumer goods for the Empire, and supplying the UEE military with everything from small arms to heavy ship components. The corporation had effectively purchased sovereignty itself, transforming Stanton into a company town the size of an entire planet. When the UEE finally corporatized the entire system in 2903, Hurston Dynamics didn't just survive the transition. They absolutely thrived, using their massive industrial capacity as leverage to secure permanent hereditary control over their toxic world. They built the towering smoke-belching factories that scar every horizon, the cramped worker dormitories stacked like disposable cargo containers, and the brutal private security forces that keep the exhausted population docile and productive. This wasn't corporate decline. This was the calculated ascent to becoming one of the four pillars of Stanton's oppressive corporate oligarchy. Today, walking through Lorville's industrial worker districts, the evidence is clear of nearly 2 centuries of corporate optimization and cost-benefit analysis. The air still burns the throat, the mortality rates are still classified as trade secrets, and the recruitment centers are still spinning glossy tales of opportunity to desperate souls arriving from the outer rim. Every few years, there's a protest, a work stoppage, or a full-blown riot, and Hurston Security responds with the same ruthless efficiency they apply to inventory management and supply chain logistics. The company doesn't see evil in any of this. They see equilibrium. Workers arrive, they extract maximum value, they expire slightly ahead of schedule, and they are seamlessly replaced. The planet keeps spinning, the furnaces keep burning, and the dividends keep paying out to distant shareholders in Terra's climate-controlled penthouses. And that is perhaps the darkest truth of all. This system isn't broken or malfunctioning. It's working exactly as it was designed to work. The most visible reminder that Hurston Dynamics never intended this world to be a home, but rather a machine built for extraction. And to understand how we reached this point, we need to travel back to 2855, when the initial corporate charter was granted by the UEE. What started as a modest mining operation rapidly evolved into something unprecedented in human history. A company given sovereign rights over an entire planet. But why would the empire grant such sweeping authority to a single entity? The answer lies in the resource crisis of the 28th century, when traditional supply chains collapsed and the government needed industrial output at any cost. Hurston offered a solution that was brutally efficient: total corporate governance in exchange for guaranteed production quotas. It was a deal that would define the next 2 centuries, setting a precedent that other corporations would soon follow. By the turn of the 29th century, Hurston had transformed from a mining consortium into a fully integrated industrial empire. The company didn't just extract resources, it manufactured the ships that transported them, employed the security forces that protected them, and eventually printed the currency that paid its workers. This vertical integration wasn't merely about efficiency, it was about control. When the UEE tried to reassert regulatory authority in 2894, Hurston's board simply threatened to withhold arms shipments to the military. So what did the empire do? They backed down, issuing the famous administrative neutrality doctrine that essentially recognized corporate law as equal to UEE law within Stanton's boundaries. This was the moment Hurston ceased to be a company and became something closer to a nation-state, complete with its own citizenship requirements and rigid social hierarchies that persist to this day. But here's the aspect nobody talks about when discussing Hurston's economic miracle: the human cost calculated into every quarterly report. The company pioneered what labor historians call generational amortization, treating workers as depreciating assets with a 20-year operational lifespan. Medical care wasn't denied. It was simply optimized to return workers to production rather than extend their lives. When the first Independent Workers Association attempted to organize in 2912, Hurston's security forces responded not with negotiations, but with orbital strikes on residential blocks. And yet, despite these documented atrocities, the UEE continues to recognize Hurston's sovereignty. Why? Because in the calculus of interstellar politics, the output of one polluted planet feeds the fleets that protect human space. The machine keeps running, and the air keeps burning, because in the end, The Empire decided long ago that some worlds were simply meant to be sacrificed. Indenture. It's a deceptively clinical term for a system where debt doesn't die with the worker. It transfers to the next of kin, chaining families to the same toxic minds for decades. And here's where Hurston's innovation truly becomes chilling. They didn't just account for labor turnover in their projections. They engineered a self-replicating workforce that literally couldn't afford to leave. When a miner in the Lorville deep shafts accumulated crushing medical debt from toxic exposure, that liability didn't vanish at death. It passed to their children, who then entered the same suffocating contracts to pay it off. So why didn't the UEE Advocacy intervene? Well, that's the uncomfortable truth about Stanton's corporate charter. Hurston wasn't breaking the law, they were writing it. The Advocacy looked the other way because the ore kept flowing, and the UEE Navy desperately needed those refined materials for their endless frontier wars. This was the template that Arc Corp and Microtech would later refine, but Hurston perfected it first. By the 27th century, this brutal efficiency had made Hurston the undisputed industrial backbone of the Eastern Empire. While other corporations struggled with labor shortages on the frontier, Hurston's population only grew because leaving wasn't an option. Let's take a step back and appreciate the scale here. We're talking about a planet where the entire atmospheric processing grid exists not for the workers, but to keep the refineries running. The Lorville worker districts aren't cities. They're maintenance facilities for human capital. And yet, from a purely economic perspective, it worked. Hurston outproduced every competitor in the Stanton system, driving down commodity prices until rivals either adopted similar practices or collapsed. This is the dark arithmetic of corporate expansion. When the business model treats human beings as depreciating assets with transferable liabilities, the profit margins become impossible to beat. Today, the northern hemisphere of Hurston bears the scars of this philosophy etched into the planet's surface. Vast chemical wastes where forests once stood. The sky itself, the color of industrial coolant. But the real question isn't how the empire got here. It's why it stays. The answer lies in what economists call path dependency. Once an entire system's infrastructure is built on disposable labor, dismantling that machine threatens not just corporate profits, but the stability of UEE supply chains. Every time the Advocacy raids a Hurston facility for labor violations, they find themselves staring down security forces with better equipment than the Navy's frontline troops. And here's the thing nobody wants to admit. Society has normalized it. When pilots buy that cheap quantum fuel or those affordable ship components, they benefit from a legacy of exploitation, so entrenched that questioning it feels like questioning gravity itself. But how did a single corporate entity gain the authority to treat an entire planet as private property? To answer that, we need to rewind to 2865, when the Hurston family secured the initial charter from the UEE to develop Stanton Roman II. Back then, this wasn't a wasteland. It was a promising mining world with rich deposits of corundum and precious metals that the empire needed for its expansion wars. The deal seemed straightforward. The Hurstons would finance the infrastructure, handle the colonization logistics, and in exchange, they'd own the mineral rights in perpetuity. What the UEE didn't anticipate was how quickly the family would weaponize that contract, interpreting administrative authority as literal sovereignty over the population. Within a decade, Hurston Dynamics had transitioned from a mining consortium into a fully realized corporate state, complete with private security forces and a legal framework that defined workers as productivity assets rather than citizens. With territorial control secured, the corporation began its vertical integration in earnest, and this is where Hurston's true genius, or perhaps its true horror, became apparent. They didn't just mine the resources, they manufactured the tools, refined the fuels, and crucially, built the ships that transported everything, creating a closed economic loop that made leaving the planet financially impossible for most inhabitants. By 2890, Hurston Dynamics had expanded into weapons manufacturing, producing the attrition line of laser repeaters that would become standard issue for budget-conscious militias across the frontier. The family understood something fundamental about the UEE. As long as the quotas were met and the taxes paid, the empire wouldn't interfere with how they treated their workforce. So they optimized for pure extraction efficiency, replacing organic labor with automation where possible, but always maintaining enough human misery to keep costs low and profits astronomical. And that brings us back to those chemical wastes we see today, because they aren't just the byproduct of industry. They're monuments to a business model that treats human beings as disposable as the ore they extract. Walk through any company town on Hurston, and you'll see the same pattern. Workers born into debt, living in hab modules they don't own, breathing air the company sells them, until the lung sickness or the accidents claim them. The corporation doesn't even bother hiding it anymore. Their propaganda celebrates the Hurston work ethic, while the reality is indentured servitude with better marketing. When the Nine Tails or other pirate groups raid these facilities, they're hitting soft targets filled with people who have nothing left to lose. So when we look at that orange sky, we aren't just seeing pollution. We're seeing the physical manifestation of a century of corporate philosophy made concrete, toxic, and utterly inescapable. To understand how we reached this point, we need to rewind to 2865, when Wallace Hurston first secured the charter for Stanton 1. Back then, the planet wasn't a wasteland. It was a blank slate, rich in heavy metals and rare earth elements that the emerging aerospace industry desperately needed. Hurston didn't see a world to build. He saw inventory to liquidate. The early surveys promised easy extraction, but the atmosphere was hostile, the terrain brutal. So Hurston made a calculation that would define the next century. Instead of investing in environmental safeguards or long-term infrastructure, he brought in disposable labor by the thousands, promised them stake shares that never vested, and designed the first refineries to burn cheap and dirty. This wasn't negligence born of ignorance. It was architecture by design, a blueprint for profit that externalized every cost onto the rock beneath their feet and the lungs of the workers above. By the turn of the 29th century, that blueprint had scaled beyond anyone's nightmares, and Hurston Dynamics wasn't merely operating in Stanton. They owned it. After the U.S. Corporate Sovereignty Act of 2884, Wallace leveraged his political connections to secure exclusive planetary rights, effectively turning the entire world into a private fiefdom. Competitors were bought out or buried under regulatory noise, and the original settlements metastasized into the industrial sprawl we see today. The company perfected a closed-loop system, wages paid in corporate scrip, housing provided by company landlords, medical care administered by company doctors who reported to company lawyers. When workers died, and they died often, the debt transferred to next of kin, ensuring the balance sheet stayed green even when the burial pits overflowed. This wasn't just capitalism, it was a new feudalism, wearing a shareholder's suit. And here we arrive at the present, where the sky itself has turned the color of rusted copper, where children are born with filtration implants already installed, and where the concept of retirement exists only in history texts. The chemical lakes we discussed earlier aren't accidents to be cleaned up. They're permanent features of the geography now, too costly to remediate and too profitable to acknowledge. Hurston Dynamics has transcended its founders' worst impulses. It has become a self-sustaining organism that treats human ambition as fuel and environmental collapse as depreciation. When we look at those towers belching smoke into the perpetual smog, we're not witnessing a failure of regulation or a tragedy of oversight. We're looking at the logical conclusion of a system that decided, long ago, that a human life was simply a resource to be extracted until depleted, then replaced. Has been replaced by expiration dates measured in lung capacity and blood toxicity levels. To understand how we arrived at this particular shade of industrial hell, we need to rewind back to 2865, when Solomon Hurston first registered the Articles of Incorporation in a cramped office on Terra. Back then, Stanton was just a resource-rich system with toxic atmospheres that scared off more squeamish developers. But Hurston saw opportunity where others saw only poison. He didn't merely want to extract minerals from the planet's crust. He envisioned a closed economic system where he owned the air, the water, and the very biological necessity of filtration itself. The early employment contracts were brutal even by frontier standards, yet the promise of steady credits drew desperate souls from across the empire like moths to a flame. Within a decade, the first atmospheric refineries began converting the sky from blue to gray, and Hurston Dynamics stopped being merely a mining company and started becoming an inevitable habitat for those with nowhere else to turn. By the time the UEE officially recognized corporate planetary sovereignty in 2903, Hurston had already built the blueprint that ArcCorp and Microtech would later copy and refine. Solomon's son, Wallace, understood something his father only intuited. Power isn't just about controlling resources, it's about controlling the narrative itself. While other corporations were content to remain miners with security teams, Hurston Dynamics rebranded itself as civilization incarnate. They built the worker housing, the security forces, the hospitals, every institution that kept people alive. They owned and operated for profit. When the UEE Navy needed refined antimatter for the growing Vandal threat, Hurston provided it at cost, securing tax exemptions and legal concessions that never expired. The planet became a company town the size of a world, and the Hurston family became something very close to royalty, complete with private estates floating above the smog line in defiance of gravity. But here's the thing nobody puts in the corporate brochures or the glossy shareholder reports. The true human cost of that antimatter, that sovereignty, that floating palace in the clouds above the poisoned surface. The filtration implants weren't a medical innovation designed to help the people. They were a cynical cost-cutting measure, calculated to avoid the expensive process of actually cleaning the atmosphere or providing real safety. Worker debt isn't an unfortunate accident of the economic system. It is the system itself, engineered so efficiently that dying on the job is statistically the only way to clear the ledger before retirement. Look at the actuarial tables. Average life expectancy planetside is 47 years, yet the mandatory work contracts run for 50. The mathematics are unforgiving and absolute. The rust-colored sky isn't just industrial pollution. It is profit margin made visible, breathed in with every shallow, desperate breath by generations who never asked for this particular legacy. Polluted surface below, because that is what Hurston is, really. Not the gleaming towers of Lorville rising above the clouds, but the wasteland underneath where the air burns workers' lungs and the soil turned toxic decades ago. We're talking about labor camps masquerading as employment centers, where workers sign contracts they don't read and wake up 10 years later with more debt than when they started. How many lungs have to scar over? How many children have to be born with adaptations they didn't ask for before we admit this isn't just business efficiency? It's something older and uglier. The company calls it atmospheric processing challenges, but let's be clear. When Hurston owns the atmosphere, when they own the law, and when they own the debt these people carry, they don't have employees. They have assets that happen to breathe. So how did we get here? To understand that, we need to go back to 2865, when Solomon Hurston wasn't yet a name carved into corporate mythology, but just another ambitious prospector with a fleet of worn-out Orions and a theory about Stanton 1's unusual mineral density. Back then, the UEE was desperate for antimatter precursors to fuel their expanding navy, and Hurston offered a simple bargain: the mineral rights in exchange for autonomy, promising to feed the war machine cheaper than anyone else in the sector. It was supposed to be temporary, a 20-year extraction license. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when the resource is finite and the profit margins are infinite. By 2895, Hurston Dynamics wasn't just mining the planet. They were terraforming the corporate structure itself, embedding themselves so deeply into the UEE's supply chain that cutting them loose would mean bleeding out. And this is where the story shifts from corporate history to something darker. In 2915, when the UEE needed credits to fund the Messer recovery and the military overextension in the Vandal border zones, Hurston made an offer that couldn't be refused: buy the planet outright. Not lease it, own it. The UEE got a trillion credit infusion. Hurston got sovereign territory, the right to make law, the right to enforce it, the right to define what citizenship even means on their world. Consider that reality for a moment. A private entity with the power to draft legislation, to operate courts, to maintain a private army that answers to shareholders instead of senators. That's not a company town. That's a company nation-state, wrapped in the legal fiction of corporate governance, and it set the template for the other three megacorps that would follow. Stanton didn't just get privatized, it got weaponized. Zone, they turned to the one entity that had liquidity when the treasury was dry. Hurston Dynamics didn't just offer a loan, they offered a bailout package that would make ancient Earth investment banks blush. The deal was simple on paper: immediate credit relief in exchange for legislative autonomy over Stanton 1. But here's the thing about deals with corporations that treat human capital as depreciation schedules: they always collect. The UEE, desperate to keep the military-industrial complex humming against the Vandal threat, signed away oversight rights that generations of reformers had fought to establish. Within 18 months, Hurston had rewritten labor statutes on their world, rebranded indentured servitude as corporate residency, and installed tracking implants that would make a prison warden jealous. So why did the Senate approve it? Because when the Treasury is bleeding credits on the frontier, principles become commodities the Senate can no longer afford. The consequences arrived not with a bang, but with a cough. By 2920, Hurston's manufacturing complexes had transformed Stanton 1 into a chemical haze so thick the sun became a rumor. Workers, corporate assets, began showing up in emergency bays with respiratory systems that looked like they'd been mining asbestos in zero gravity. And this is where Hurston's innovation truly shines through. They didn't deny the health crisis, they monetized it. Medical debt became another chain binding workers to the company store, quite literally, since wages were paid in Hurston credits redeemable only at Hurston facilities. But here's what nobody talks about when romanticizing the corporate frontier: every pollution cloud has a silver lining for those selling the remedy. The company had created a perfect closed loop: poison the environment, charge for the cure, and ensure nobody could afford to leave. It was capitalism, distilled to its logical, brutal endpoint. Today, when traders set course for Lorville, they see a monument to industrial efficiency rising from the toxic dust. But locals know better. They know that the impressive skyscrapers rest on foundations of indentured labor, that the cheap fuel filling their tanks carries a cost measured in lifespans. So what does this teach us about the UEE's grand experiment in corporate governance? It reveals that when a planet is privatized, the government doesn't just outsource infrastructure, it outsources morality. Hurston didn't corrupt a system. They simply followed the incentives to their natural conclusion. And as we look toward the future of Stanton, with Pyro opening to expansion and new corporate charters being drafted, we have to ask, did the Empire learn from Hurston's rise, or did they just take notes on how to replicate it elsewhere? Because in 2954, the assembly lines are still humming, the smog is still thick, and the credits are still flowing. The only question is who pays the interest. They know that the impressive skyscrapers rest on foundations poured with blood and binding contracts signed centuries ago. To understand how Hurston Dynamics became the behemoth it is today, we need to travel back to 2865, when the Stanton system was first opened for corporate settlement, and the UEE was desperate to offload the costs of frontier administration onto private investors. The original Hurston family didn't just bid for mining rights. They negotiated a planetary charter that essentially granted them sovereignty over an entire world, creating a template that 3 other corporations would rush to copy within the decade. It was a deal that would make feudal lords jealous, complete with the right to maintain private security forces and legislate worker housing standards without any federal oversight or basic labor protections. But here's the thing that gets overlooked in the history books: they weren't just industrialists looking for resources. They were visionaries who saw humanity's future as a rigid hierarchy of shareholders and disposable assets, with the planet itself treated as nothing more than raw material waiting to be processed into quarterly profit statements and shareholder dividends. And this is where things get interesting. By 2890, Hurston had transformed from a modest mining operation into the UEE's largest manufacturer of small arms and munitions, supplying military contractors across 3 systems. They weren't just extracting resources anymore. They were vertically integrated, owning every step from the ore in the ground to the weapon in the soldier's hands, ensuring that profit flowed upward at every transaction. The Lorville we recognize today began as a company town that metastasized into a continent-spanning megalopolis, with the central tower rising as a physical manifestation of corporate ambition that literally cast shadows over the worker districts. But growth on this scale required labor, and lots of it. So Hurston pioneered the employment lottery system, marketing it as opportunity while effectively creating generational debt slavery. Workers signed contracts they couldn't read, took housing advances they couldn't repay, and found themselves legally bound to assembly lines that never stopped humming with the rhythm of quarterly earnings reports. But here's the thing nobody talks about when they admire those gleaming exports. The atmospheric processors that keep Lorville breathable are running at redline, not for the workers, but to protect the manufacturing equipment from corrosive dust. The red dust that coats everything isn't just a geological feature. It's the byproduct of strip mining operations that turned fertile valleys into toxic wastelands, and the company charges residents for the filters that keep them alive. And those workers, they're not employees in any meaningful sense. They're assets with serial numbers, living in hab blocks where the air recyclers break down but the surveillance systems never do. When the advocacy looks the other way because Hurston's taxes fund the Navy, who's left to enforce basic human rights? The answer is no one. And that's the true legacy of this corporate empire. A proof of concept that in the right legal framework, you can own a world and everyone on it, as long as you keep the quarterly profits rising faster than the body count. The investment portfolios of shareholders in the executive towers. Because in the calculus of Hurston Dynamics, breathable air isn't a human right. It's a resource allocation problem, and workers are merely expendable variables in a quarterly equation. This isn't some unfortunate bug in their system. It's the entire operating philosophy that transformed them from a fledgling mining operation into a planetary hegemon with absolute control. When we examine those early days of Stanton colonization with clear eyes, we see the pattern emerge with disturbing clarity. Every technological triumph, every export milestone, every glowing earnings report built on the foundational understanding that human suffering is simply externalized cost. And that brings us to the uncomfortable question that's been lurking beneath this entire history. Was this corruption of the corporate dream inevitable from the start? To answer that, we have to look beyond Hurston's borders and recognize what their models spawned across the empire. ArcCorp saw the efficiency of disposable labor and built entire cities on that principle. Microtech refined the surveillance state to protect intellectual property above human dignity. Crusader, while kinder in marketing, still treats its workforce as renewable assets. Hurston didn't just pollute a planet. They perfected a template for corporate governance that treats citizenship as a consumable resource. 3 centuries later, the workers of Lorville still breathe that red line air, still sign away their rights for company scrip, still die young so that stock prices can live long. And here's the tragedy. We've normalized it. We call it frontier economics or corporate sovereignty, as if these are natural laws rather than choices made by people who valued margins over lives. So when historians ask what Hurston Dynamics truly contributed to human civilization, the answer isn't found in the quantum drives or the refined metals that built our interstellar fleets. Their real legacy is the stark demonstration that when we strip away regulation, morality, and civic accountability, a corporation will inevitably colonize not just land and resources, but the very concept of human worth itself. They showed us the logical endpoint of unchecked capitalism, a world where the sky itself is rationed, where every breath is leased from the company's store, and where the only freedom left is the freedom to work until the body breaks. In 2954, Hurston stands not as an aberration or historical curiosity, but as a mirror reflecting what we chose to become when we prioritized endless profit over basic human dignity. And that is a history we cannot afford to breathe easy about.